The Battle of Lewis's Farm was fought on March 29, 1865, in Dinwiddie County, Virginia near the end of the American Civil War. In climactic battles at the end of the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, usually referred to as the Siege of Petersburg, starting with Lewis's Farm, the Union Army commanded by Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant dislodged the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia commanded by General Robert E. Lee from defensive lines at Petersburg, Virginia and the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Many historians and the United States National Park Service consider the Battle of Lewis's Farm to be the opening battle of the Appomattox Campaign, which resulted in the surrender of Lee's army on April 9, 1865. In the early morning of March 29, 1865, two corps of the Union Army of the Potomac, the 5th Corps under Major General Governor K. Warren and the 2nd Corps under Major General Andrew A. Humphreys, moved to the south and west of the Union line south of Petersburg toward the end of the Confederate line. The Confederate defenses were manned by the 4th Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia under the command of Lieutenant General Richard H. Anderson. The corps only included the division of Major General Bushrod Johnson. Turning north and marching up the Quaker Road toward the Confederate line, Warren's lead brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain, engaged 3 brigades of Johnson's division at the Louis Farm, reinforced by a 4-gun artillery battery and later relieved by 2 large regiments from the brigade commanded by Colonel Edgar M. Gregory. The Union troops ultimately forced the Confederates back to their defenses and captured an important road junction. Chamberlain was wounded and narrowly escaped capture. Union Colonel Alfred L. Pearson was awarded the Medal of Honor 32 years later for his heroic actions at the battle. Casualties were nearly even at 381 for the Union and 371 for the Confederates, but as the battle ended, Warren's corps held an important objective, a portion of the Boydton Plank Road at its junction with the Quaker Road. Within hours, Major General Philip Sheridan's Cavalry Corps, which was still acting apart from the Army of the Potomac as the Army of the Shenandoah, occupied Dinwiddie Courthouse. This action also severed the Boydton Plank Road. The Union forces were close to the Confederate line and poised to attack the Confederate flank. The important road junction of Five Forks and the 2 Confederate railroad lines to Petersburg and Richmond that remained open to the 2 cities. On April 2–3, 1865, the Confederates evacuated Petersburg and Richmond and began to move to the west. After a number of setbacks and mostly small battles, but including a significant Confederate defeat of the Battle of Sailor's Creek on April 6, 1865, by the end of June 1865, all Confederate armies had surrendered and the Confederacy's government had collapsed. Background: Richmond-Petersburg Campaign on June 15–18, 1864, 2 Union Army Corps moved unobserved from the stalemated battle lines just north of Richmond across the James River to the south of Petersburg, Virginia. The Union force which joined with the Union Army of the James at Petersburg failed to seize the city from a small force of Confederate defenders at the Second Battle of Petersburg. By June 18, 1864, the Army of Northern Virginia had reinforced the defenders and the 292-day Richmond-Petersburg campaign had begun. Grant's strategy had to become a campaign of trench warfare attrition in which the Union forces tried to wear down the Confederate Army, destroy or cut off sources of supply and supply lines to Petersburg and Richmond and to extend the lines which the outnumbered and declining Confederate force had to defend to the breaking point. During the rest of 1864 and early 1865, Grant slowly moved his forces in the Union line south of Petersburg to the west in 6 more Petersburg offensives, usually with simultaneous attacks at or near the Richmond lines. The Confederates extended their lines to compensate for these moves, but they were stretched increasingly thin, with supplies and men increasingly hard for Lee to obtain or replace. He knew that his army could not defend Petersburg and Richmond from the growing Union forces indefinitely, especially with the expected arrival of Union reinforcements from recent recruits in training. Major General Philip Sheridan's cavalry divisions from the Shenandoah Valley and possibly even Major General William T. Sherman's armies already operating in North Carolina when the roads dried out after spring rains abated. After the Battle of Hatcher's Run on February 5–7, 1865 extended the lines another 4 miles, Lee had few reserves after manning the new defenses. He then knew that part or all of his army must leave the Richmond and Petersburg lines, obtain food and supplies at Danville, Virginia or possibly Lynchburg, Virginia, and join General Joseph E. Johnston's force opposing Sherman's army. If the Confederates could quickly defeat Sherman, they might turn back to oppose Grant before he could combine his forces with the remainder of Sherman's. Lee began preparations for the movement and informed Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Confederate States Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge of his conclusions and plan. Lee accepted Major General John B. Gordon's proposal to attempt to break the Union lines and threaten their supply base at City Point, Virginia, by attacking along a narrow front near Fort Stedman, east of Petersburg and south of the Appomattox River, in order to compel Grant to shorten his lines, at least temporarily. If successful, this could give Lee an opportunity to shorten his lines and an opening and a head start in a movement to the west and toward North Carolina. After Gordon's Confederate surprise attack on Fort Stedman in the pre-dawn hour of March 25, 1865 had some initial success, a Union counterattack at the Battle of Fort Stedman recaptured the fort and forced the Confederates to return to their lines and give up their advance picket line, including much of the western part of that line. In the afternoon at the Battle of Jones's Farm, the Confederates suffered about 4,000 casualties, which they could ill afford. He also knew that Grant would soon move against the only remaining Confederate supply lines to Petersburg, the South Side Railroad and the Boydton Plank Road, beyond the end of his current defenses. Grant already had issued orders on March 24, 1865 for an offensive to begin on March 29 and was not deterred by the Battle of Fort Stedman. Grant planned for Sheridan's cavalry to cut the remaining open railroads, the South Side Railroad and the Richmond and Danville Railroad to Richmond, and for the infantry to turn the Confederates out of their positions if possible. On March 28, Grant told Sheridan to lead his troops around the Confederate right flank and to fight the Confederates with infantry support if the Confederates came out of their trenches. Otherwise, Sheridan should wreck the railroads as much as possible and either return to the Petersburg lines or join Sherman in North Carolina at his discretion. Grant ordered 2 corps of the Army of the Potomac, the 5th Corps under Major General Governor K. Warren and the 2nd Corps under Major General Andrew A. Humphreys, to support Sheridan on his right flank, to the east of his objectives. Grant wanted these infantry corps to outflank the Confederates in their defenses and prevent them from interfering with Sheridan's mission, pushing him back to their lines if they came out to fight. Warren's corps initially also was ordered to seize Dinwiddie Courthouse, Virginia, which also would capture a portion of the Boydton Plank Road at that location, but later that task was given to Sheridan. Under Grant's order, on the night of March 27–28, Major General Edward Ord quietly moved units from the Army of the James, including 2 divisions of Major General John Gibbon's 24th Corps, a division of Major General Godfrey Weitzel's 25th Corps and Brigadier General Ranald S. Mackenzie's cavalry division from the Richmond lines to fill in the Petersburg lines to be vacated by the 2nd Corps when they moved to support Sheridan. Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps defending the Richmond lines failed to detect Ord's movement, thus limiting the number of men Lee could move to counter the movement of Grant's forces without fatally weakening the Richmond lines. Description of area roads. A good verbal description of the roads and positions in the area, given by Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain in his 1915 book The Passing of the Armies, is recited in the footnote. On March 29, crossed Rowanty Creek and proceeded west on Vaughan Road to the intersection with Quaker Road. Warren reported to his immediate superior, Major General George G. Meade, who remained in direct tactical command of the Army of the Potomac, that Dinwiddie Courthouse was undefended. By 8:45 a.m., Meade sent an order to Warren which arrived at 10:20 a.m., and told Warren to advance in strength on the Quaker Road across Gravelly Run and contact the Second Corps to his right. Warren misunderstood or ignored the order and sent only Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain's brigade up the Quaker Road until noon. Then Warren sent other units forward in response to a second order from Meade. The Second Corps moved from Hatcher's Run at about 6:30 a.m. Humphreys was careful not to leave a gap between his corps at Hatcher's Run and the troops of the 24th Corps, which took the positions in the Union line that were being vacated by the Second Corps. Meade wanted the 5th Corps to move up the Quaker Road to prevent a gap developing between the 5th Corps and the 2nd Corps. After having moved over the Vaughan Road to within 2 miles of Dinwiddie Courthouse, Chamberlain's brigade marched a short distance back to the Quaker Road and led the Union advance north on that road, as Meade had ordered Warren. After leading the brigade about 1.5 miles north on Quaker Road, Chamberlain's skirmishers reported that the bridge over Gravelly Run had been destroyed and that Confederates were entrenched on the other side. Confederate Lieutenant General Richard H. Anderson, as the corps commander of only the division of Major General Bushrod Johnson, was stationed on the Confederate right flank west of Petersburg at Hatcher's Run about 4 miles east of Five Forks and immediately south of Sutherland Station. When Confederate scouts reported that a large force of Union infantry was moving north on Quaker Road, Anderson ordered Johnson to drive them back to Vaughan Road. 3 Confederate regiments of the brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Henry A. Wise, followed by the brigades of Brigadier Generals William H. Wallace, young Marshal Moody and Matt Whitaker Ransom, moved south on the Quaker Road and the Boydton Plank Road with the intent of carrying out the order. Fighting begins. Chamberlain placed the 198th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment on the right side of the road to fire on the Confederates as a diversion, while he led the 185th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment across Gravelly Run to attack the Confederate right flank, where a hand-to-hand fight developed. Both Union regiments were oversized for that time period, with about 1,000 officers and men. The rest of Chamberlain's brigade crossed the stream following the New Yorkers' attack. The Confederates retreated to the Louis farmhouse clearing about 1 mile further north on the Quaker Road. After a stand near the farmhouse, the Confederates moved back into the woods, where they were reinforced by other Confederate soldiers behind breastworks. Here, the Confederates drove back the advancing Union skirmishers, but not without losing about 100 men as prisoners. Chamberlain brought the rest of his men forward, and the Confederates who had moved out to meet the skirmishers again returned to their works. Chamberlain wounded, rallies his men after a pause in the fighting. Chamberlain's division commander, Brigadier General Charles Griffin, came forward and told Chamberlain that the Confederate position must be taken. Deploying men to both sides of the Quaker Road, Chamberlain, on horseback, led a charge up the Quaker Road toward the Confederates' strong point, a large sawdust pile that provided cover for many Confederate soldiers. Chamberlain got ahead of his men and became an obvious target. He was wounded in the arm and his horse was wounded in the neck. Chamberlain slumped on his horse, initially unconscious, but regained consciousness in time to respond to General Griffin, who had come up to check on Chamberlain's condition. Then Chamberlain rallied his Pennsylvania regiment, who were retreating from a Confederate charge. When his wounded horse could not continue, Chamberlain went to the front of his line on foot. Several Confederate soldiers soon appeared and demanded Chamberlain's surrender. Chamberlain had lost his hat and was wearing a faded coat, almost gray in color. Pretending to be a Confederate officer, he led the Confederates back toward Union soldiers who promptly captured him. Union reinforcements drive back Confederates after another brief pause. Chamberlain saw that his New York regiment was being driven back from an attempt to take the Confederate works in the woods ahead. Chamberlain and the regiment's officers steadied the men, and soon they pushed the Confederates back until Union artillery under regular Army Lieutenant John Mitchell came up with 4 guns to support them. Despite the artillery fire, the Confederates tried to outflank and charge the Union position. Chamberlain's men and the artillery held the position, but then the Confederates charged the Pennsylvania troops in the center and on the right of the Union position. These Union soldiers were nearly out of ammunition and began to slowly retreat. As Chamberlain's line was falling back, his 1st Brigade was reinforced by the 188th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment and the 155th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment of Colonel Edgar M. Gregory's 2nd Brigade. Colonel Alfred L. Pearson led the Pennsylvanians to the center and toward the sawdust pile that the Confederates were using for cover. Pearson grabbed the regimental colors and charged toward the sawdust pile with his men following and passing through the ranks of the exhausted 1st Brigade. 32 years later, Pearson was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Lewis's Farm. When they saw these Union reinforcements, the Confederates retreated to their main entrenchments along White Oak Road, abandoning control of the Boydton Plank Road and leaving behind badly wounded men and some others who surrendered. Chamberlain then positioned his men along with the artillery battery on either side and in front of the Louis Farm buildings. Number engaged casualties. Chamberlain wrote that he had fewer than 1,700 officers and men in his brigade and that his reinforcements numbered about 1,000. He wrote that the Confederates had 6,277 effective officers and men in Johnson's division according to their morning report. He stated that he lost about a quarter of his men while the Confederate total loss was slight in numbers, although a paragraph after this statement, he said that he saw that evening 150 dead and severely wounded Confederates lying around the breastworks and noted that almost 200 prisoners had been taken by his brigade. Modern casualty estimates are 381 for the Union force and 371 for the Confederates.